Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Make your way into the conference room, please. Grab your last bagel bite. Find a seat. We're about to get started. So, my name is Caitlin Peterson. I am Associate Director and a Research Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. Wonderful to see you all. I'd like to be the first to welcome you to our first in-person Fall Policy Conference since 2019. It's an exciting day. Yeah. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today, and welcome as well to all the folks who are tuning in online via live webcast. We're just so happy you could join us. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit policy research institute. We have offices in San Francisco and here in Sacramento. And just a quick disclaimer, we're a public charity, so PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measures or legislation. Neither do we support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. That said, at the Water Policy Center, we have a mission, and our mission is to connect objective research and data with real-world water management challenges for the benefit of California's communities, environment, and economy. I'd like to thank our fantastic group of sponsors for making today's event possible and for supporting the production of the policy brief, Priorities for California's Water, which you should see a copy of on your table. The theme of this year's brief is Thriving with Less. So it lays out the state of water in California, basically, including the challenges confronting water users and managers as they adapt to both hotter and more intense droughts on the one hand, as well as extreme but less frequent wet years on the other hand. I'd encourage you to join us as a sponsor or a donor so that we can continue to make this brief and events like today's possible, and ensure that they're free and open to the public, whether you're here in person or online. So more information, including some donor cards, is available at your tables. Also at your tables, as I said, copies of the priorities brief, and a few copies of today's agenda and program as well. There's also a QR code on the tent cards in the middle of the table, so if you scan that code, you can access today's agenda, bios for all of our speakers. Also, outside, just in front of you as you exit the doors, you can find and check out other PPIC Water Policy Center publications at our publications table. And while you're checking out the agenda and bios on our website, you'll also be able to find event videos and a copy of the slides from today's event, which will be posted on our website a couple of days after the event. So lots of good stuff on our website. Quick rundown of today's program. First, we are going to hear from Water Policy Center Senior Fellow Jeffrey Mount, who's going to lay out what the science says about our state's changing climate and what that means for our water resources. This is going to be followed by 3 amazing panel discussions. So the first panel is about shortage. What are our strategies for dealing with dry years? The second is about surplus. How do we manage the wet years to better help us through the dry years? We'll pause for a 15-minute break after that panel, after which we'll reconvene for our third panel. This panel is going to bring in policy leaders from both the state and federal levels to discuss the role that policy plays in helping us adapt and helping manage our water amidst all these extremes. There is going to be time for audience Q&A at the end of each panel, so keep that in mind, have your questions ready. For all of you in the room, just raise your hand. We have a couple of PPIC staff who will be running around with microphones, and they will come to you. They'll hold on to the microphone for you, and you can just speak into that microphone. For virtual attendees, you can submit your questions to our email, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. So we'll be monitoring that inbox regularly and try and incorporate those questions as we can. At the end of today's program, we'll be providing lunch, so we do hope you can stick around for that. It's a great time to mingle and network. Last housekeeping items. Later today, you'll get an email with a short survey. Please do take the time to fill that out. It really helps us improve our events for the future. And lastly, if you have a cell phone, now would be a great time to turn it off or silence that ringer. My time is up, so I would like to hand it over to Jeffrey Mount. And we'll begin our program. Jeff's going to be presenting on what the science says about our changing climate and what we mean by thriving with less. Jeff?
Thank you, Katie. I get to be the opening act, which is great. And also thank you to all of you who showed up today. Today I got reminded I still know how to tie a tie. Since it's been 3 years since I wore a tie. And in fact, I'm not wearing shorts for the meeting as I usually do. Okay, so my job is to sort of set the context for the discussions we're going to have today, and many of you have already looked at the policy priorities brief that we've handed out to you, and I'm going to repeat some of the things that are within it. But let me just go right to the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is that conditions have changed. We are no longer talking about some future existential threat. That what we are talking about, the body of science, which is ahead in front of us, is telling us we're now moved into the era of the hot drought, and that is the signature of the 21st century. And we're setting all our temperature records, which is key. But that's not just it. We've had plenty of hot droughts in the past, although nothing is quite as hot as we're having now. Things have changed, and this is a lot of hand-wringing and wranglings going on in the scientific community over the aspect of this change, and that is we have a thirstier atmosphere. So beginning around 2000 or 2002, we saw a significant shift in what's called evaporative demand. And that is basically the ability of the atmosphere to extract water from the landscape, is the way to think about this. And this has played a major role in the changes we've seen, whether you're looking at forest health in these systems or just overall water demand. And that's because a whole lot of the water is just simply going back into the atmosphere. It is not making it into our groundwater systems. It's not making it into our soils. It's being extracted out of our vegetation. That is a significant change, and it is not just significant, but it was mind-boggling in 2021. This is a nice graphic you see on the right from Mike Dettinger, when he basically took the northern half of the state and he looked at evaporative demand in the northern half of the state all the way back to 1980. And what you just see is there's been this pretty dramatic shift. So 2021, and I'm going to come back to 2021, 2021 was a remarkable year. So even in this year, where we kept saying, 2022 is not like that. It was cooler, it was damper, even though it was dry, it's still way above the long-term average that we've seen for evaporative demand. So this is the most fundamental change. And the question is, when you sit down with my climate science friends, usually after you buy them a beer, you will ask them, is this permanent? Is this the future? And we had a great argument by email the other day. No, it's going to rain again. I mean, there's no climate models to suggest we're locked into what we've seen for the last 10 years indefinitely. It will rain again. It will get wet again. But this evaporative demand is probably here to stay. So we have seen that change, and it's driven largely by temperature, but other issues, including vapor pressure in the atmosphere, winds in the atmosphere, and even solar radiation. So it's more than just temperature, but it is a permanent change. And that comes back to this theme of today's discussion. All right, we have to start thinking about thriving with less, because what that means is our droughts are becoming much more intense, although it will rain again, I promise you. So I'm going to sort of walk through something that will annoy half of you, and that is we tend to deal with water problems in California once things break. So we have to break them first. Ellen and I were on a book we wrote years ago. We wanted to call it Floods, Droughts, and Lawsuits, because that's when things get broken and we actually make real progress in policy. But the 2012-2016 drought broke our groundwater system, particularly in the Central Valley. As we saw, dramatic level groundwater decline and of course, significant water quality degradation. Of course, the big signature was land subsidence, which the press really liked paying attention to. Significant surface water depletions, and of course, all of this culminated in one of the most significant policy advances in a generation, if not in 100 years, and that's the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And implementing that act over the next 20 years will truly transform water and the way we manage water. But I also want to point out that year of extraordinary evaporative demand broke the Central Valley water system. Greg Gartrell did a fantastic report for us this last spring that if you haven't read, for those of you who are water wonks, it's really worth taking a hard look at. And Greg did probably the most refined accounting of water use in the Central Valley as it relates to Delta. And his calculations were pretty clear. We looked at them again and again because we didn't believe them. Not Greg, we didn't believe the calculations. And that is, we broke the system in 2021. We used every drop of water that ran off the landscape in the Central Valley in 2021. Every drop. All the water that was used for outflow to maintain salinities in the Delta and to meet a little bit was used to meet environmental requirements came from the reservoirs. And they were already in pretty bad shape after that time. That is a scary outcome, and we need to pay a really close attention to that break in the system. And then the question we have here, and will be discussed today, is did we break the Colorado this year? The Colorado conditions have been worsening. It's a slow-rolling train disaster in the Colorado that we've seen, where we vastly overestimated how much water is in that system and divided up the pie. But we did that 100 years ago, and we're really starting to see the effects of that now. And what has happened is even though it's a slow train wreck, it's threshold-based, and we've pushed past these thresholds. So this is really threatening a significant source of water, particularly in Southern California and in the Imperial Irrigation District. So we need to think about the Colorado as our less reliable source. I mean, Metropolitan thinks of it as their drought reserve, for example. It is likely to be less important in the future. Okay, so that's my Dr. Doom side. I want to remind you, we're seeing the effects of not just this last drought, the 2012-2016 drought, but of course the current drought, 2020 to 2022. And in fact, I will argue this is just one drought. We've been in one 10-year drought. We had 2 wet years out of 10. So it's just been a continuous drought, 2 wet years. And of course, we've seen a lot of work. Josue and Alvar and others who've been looking at the impacts in the Sacramento Valley, for example. We've seen more than 500,000 acres of fallowed land, most of that in rice land in the Sacramento Valley, something we did not expect 10 years ago. Of course, we're continuing. Now the New York Times has picked it up again, dry drinking wells. Tight supplies. For the first time ever in recent memory, Southern California is really worried about the future of their supplies because they had made so many investments. They looked pretty good, particularly in the last drought. And of course, the long-term crisis for the management of biodiversity in California, something that tends to slip off the radar in all of this. So significant impacts. But the theme of today is we have the capacity to adapt to this. What we need to acknowledge is we're going to be dealing with less water. So how do we adapt to this? And so you get some of the things you're going to hear about today. It remains smart demand management, top of the list. We have to manage demand when you have less water. And there's lots of good things going on. So, I mean, we're making significant efficiency gains both in urban and agricultural use. We're starting to see more flexible trading, and as we will repeatedly say, we need nimble state oversight in order to facilitate demand management. This is really going to be critical. But we also need to continue to make strategic supply investments. Alternative supplies, such as recycled water, stormwater recapture, even desal in some areas. So alternative supplies are going to be absolutely critical. Remember, I am not talking about increasing supply. I'm talking how you deal with less. Okay, so that there's less is probably the best way to describe it. Storage, the report that Greg did recently, and then a report that Sarah Null led last summer that we did at PPIC, storage is absolutely critical for all phases of water management, and we need to take a whole hard look at both above and below ground storage again as we think about this declining reliability and supply. And of course, this is taking advantage of wet years. One of the things I'm sorry, Greg, I keep calling you out. I'm glad you're here. One of the things that came out of Greg's report that was so striking to us is how poorly we manage wet years. When there is sufficient when there's sufficient water for us to do significant storage without impacting the environment or other water users. And that's what happened in 2017. I mean, in 2017, Greg's simple calculations without changing a single regulation or anything is we left at least 800,000 acre-feet of water on the table because we had no place to put it. And it was just as simple as that. We had no place to put it. So no changing any environmental regulations that would have happened without any impact on the environment. So we said maybe we need to really have better, stronger wet year strategies while we're thinking of dry year strategies. So we suggest that in our report. We cannot forget that in all of this, we're seeing significant impacts. Thank you to the New York Times yesterday for bringing that up again. Significant impacts, particularly on rural communities, and also financial impacts. But we're also, as you're going to hear today, and we said the elephant in the room, the footprint of agriculture is going to shrink in California. We don't see any other way around it. It is going to shrink. The debate will be over how much, but the real serious debate should be around farmland transitions. Katie and her group has done some tremendous work on this, and we're going to have to focus on that farmland transition and safety nets. The governor released in late summer, released this drought strategy, supply strategy. The good news, it addresses many of these things. But let me add just one little thing. We have a very gentle nudge in our policy report that the thing that was left out, the strategy was strategy for supply for communities and strategy for supply for farms. The strategy for the supply for the environment was we'll deal with it somewhere else and we'll do no harm. That strategy hasn't worked. And so I think as we think through this, remember it is a three-legged stool, okay? Supply for communities, supply for farms, supply for the environment. We have to somehow move, as a report we did this last summer, we somehow have to move away from viewing the environment as a constraint and shifting it to a primary objective. And how do we do that in the face of these changing conditions? We're going to have a lot more to say about this over the next couple of years at PPIC as how one does that. So that, again, that was our gentle nudge. Oh, and by the way, there's money. I mean, usually we talk about this stuff. We say, oh my God, we've got to figure out a way to finance all this thing. Suddenly, we probably have more money than we can choke down. And again, that's the product of these last few years. Significant federal support is out there, and then, of course, as you see, a total funding of more than $10 billion available for water, with significant amounts available for drought response and nature-based solutions. So that's a lot of money. Now, there's a caveat, as you saw LAO's report. Some of this may get clawed back in the years ahead, so we don't know how much there will actually be available. But it's unprecedented short-term surge. We still don't have a good understanding of what happens in the long term. So I want to set this last thing up for the panel today. As our priorities brief says, we have to think differently. Our focus has been always to try and increase supplies, okay? But now we have to, the focus has to shift to thinking how to live with less and how to do it well. And we will maintain, this is just, I've lost my Dr. Doom cape when I say this, we will maintain that we can and we will continue to thrive. We've shown extraordinary adaptive capacity in the past. There's no reason to think we can't do it in the future and continue to prosper as a state. It's too bad we have to break things in order to fix it. But that's where we are today. We broke our groundwater system. We broke our surface water supply system in the Central Valley. We're probably breaking the Colorado. But that gives us great motivation for getting on to and dealing with these factors. But again, so what you're going to hear today in our panels is how to live with how to thrive with less. That has been our theme all along, is how to better manage it. So with that, I would like to introduce my good colleague and friend, Professor, and for those of you who don't know that, you can ask him, Professor Alvar Escrivá, who will be going to UCLA this next year as a professor. We're all very proud of him and his work. And Alvar's panel is going to basically tackle, in this next session, some of these thorny questions that we've raised. So, Alvar.